Hi guys, welcome to Learn Kenyan Law with Wanjiku, and this is the channel where you get legally informed on different matters. And for today, we're specifically talking about property law. We will be asking ourselves, what are the responsibilities of having an advocate in matters land? Why do I need to get an advocate when I am planning to sell my land? Why do I need to get an advocate when I want to purchase land? Which kind of instructions must be taken by the advocate who I'm dealing with? And what are the obligations of that advocate? So now let us delve into the responsibilities of an advocate when they are acting on behalf of the seller. So these are the kind of information that the advocate is going to be obtaining if they are acting on behalf of you, the seller. They are going to need the full name and the address of the parties who are involved. Of course, they are going to get the names of the buyer or the purchaser's advocate if the buyer has chosen to have an advocate, and of course, any estate agents who are involved. The second thing the advocate is going to be asking are the full particulars of the properties concerned. The advocate is going to be asking, is this land that you're selling a freehold or is it a leasehold? The next thing that the advocate is going to be asking is, what is the price? For how much are you planning to sell this land? Are there any preliminary deposit that are required? And if so, to whom does it need to be paid to? Such information is important because sometimes when you're selling a property, the deposit is sent to the advocate. It is not sent to you directly. And sometimes if you agree, the deposit is also sent to you directly as the seller, depending on what you agree with your advocate. The next important thing that your advocate who is acting on behalf of the seller is going to require are the details of any mortgage or charge on the property. This is to say you're selling property that had mortgage, or rather you had an outstanding balance with the bank. The advocate is going to be asking for such details. The advocate is also going to be asking if the property is vacant. Are there any chattels? Are there any such issues? The advocate is going to need to understand, is there someone at the property right now? Yes or no, such information. Another important thing that the advocate who is acting on behalf of the seller is going to be asking is, which is the expected date of completion? You're selling this land, yes. When do you prefer that this kind of deal is completed? When is the purchasing money going to be available? Such information is what the seller is, the advocate acting on behalf of the seller is going to ask. Another important thing to note when you have hired an advocate and you're the one who is selling the land, some of the fundamental duties of the specific advocate that you're hiring is, number one, they're the ones who are going to prepare the agreement. They're going to be responsible to prepare the title documents. They're also going to be responsible in approving the transfer or conveyance. They're also going to procure execution of transfer of conveyance. And of course, they're also going to attest the execution of a transfer, and they're also going to receive and account for the proceeds of sale to you as the client. So of course, that is why I keep on insisting, when you want to sell a land, make sure you get an advocate. As you have seen, there's a lot of responsibilities that an advocate who is acting on behalf of the seller has. Let us dive in on why do you need an advocate when you are purchasing land. The advocate who is acting on behalf of a purchaser is also going to ask similar questions that the advocate of the seller has asked. Of course, your advocate as the purchaser is going to ask the full names of the seller. He's going to ask the particulars of the property, whether it's on leasehold or on freehold. He's going to ask, how much are you buying this property? What is the price? Are there any deposits that are required? What are the details of any mortgages that might be there? Is the property vacant? What is the expected date of completion? Such things. However, it is very important to note that the advocate who is acting on behalf of the purchaser is able to advise the purchaser on some following important issues. These include finances. They're also going to advise you on the possible future liability for taxes. They're also going to talk about the legal costs and the expenses of the conveyance. And of course, the purchaser's advocate is also responsible for some of the most important things. And number one, he or she is responsible for carrying out the search. This basically means that you have gone and you want to buy this land, so your advocate is going to go to the Ministry of Land, and search to just make sure that this land belongs to the person who is saying they're selling it. They're also going to be scrutinizing the title documents. Sometimes there's a lot of faking going on. The advocate who is acting on behalf of the purchaser is responsible to scrutinize the title documents and just authenticate them. He or she is going to approve the sale agreement and send out requisition for the same. So after all this process has been done, The advocate acting on behalf of the purchaser is going now to also send or approve a sale agreement. Remember, we have said the advocate who is acting on behalf of the purchaser is also responsible for coming up with a document. So after the advocate acting on behalf of the seller has come up with an agreement, he or she sends it to the advocate acting on behalf of the purchaser. And so your advocate is going to approve the sale agreement. And if they have any questions, they can also ask. Another thing that an advocate who is acting on behalf of the purchaser does, they prepare transfer and engrosses the same. They also attend to the execution of the conveyance. And of course, they also help you in stamping and lodging documents for registration. This is very important. I have previously talked about the importance of registration of land. So the advocate acting on behalf of the purchaser is going to help in stamping and lodging documents for registration. The advocate also obtains and pays the purchase money to the seller's advocate. So those are some of the most important duties of an advocate who is acting on behalf of you as the purchaser of land. So now we're going to dive in and ask ourselves, what happens when one advocate is acting for both parties? Sometimes you find that the advocate or the lawyer is acting for both the purchaser and both for the seller. It is very important for me to point this out. Ethical and professional responsibility issues might arise. Of course, the general principle is that an advocate is obliged to refrain from acting for both parties. Because, of course, sometimes an issue might arise, a conflict might arise, and this advocate might not know how to solve it. So basically, I'm going to encourage you to have your own advocate if you're the seller and have a different advocate if you're the purchaser. However, it is important for me to point out that sometimes in this field, sometimes you'll get that the seller's advocate is also the purchaser's advocate. So now let us dive into other instructions that must be taken by the advocate. Of course, we've talked about the name and addresses of the client. That is important. The details of the property which is being sold. We have also talked about being very clear on whether your advocate is going to be the one receiving the deposit or whether you're the one who's going to be receiving the deposit. That is if you're a seller, although there is no legal requirement that a deposit is a clear indication that the purchaser is committed to the transaction. However, of course, you know, when a purchaser pays a seller a deposit, at least it shows some commitment, but that is not a legal requirement. And of course, information pertaining to the completion date ought to be acquired. Those are some of the important instructions that must be taken. We continue and we also talk about the information in regards to the sources of purchase of the money. Of course, this is important when one is required to give a professional undertaking. Another important thing to note is that care must be taken to ascertain whether there is a need for any special terms. Remember, we have said when you have an advocate who is acting on behalf of the seller, they are the ones who are responsible with coming up with the agreement. Of course, you as the purchaser, you have to be very careful. The advocate who is acting on behalf of the purchaser has to be very careful just to make sure and ascertain whether there is need of any special terms to include in the agreement. Of course, the nature of property ownership is another important instruction that has to be taken, just to establish who owns the property in question. And of course, once the agreement for sale has been approved, it must be executed. And upon execution, it must be stamped, although the failure to stamp is not a fatal to the document, but I really encourage you to just make sure that the document has been stamped. So the next thing that we're going to be talking about are the further obligations of an advocate. Still, remember we're talking about an advocate in matters land. Either this advocate is acting on behalf of the seller or this advocate is acting on behalf of the purchaser. The advocate has to obtain a rates clearance certificate. And of course, this is required with respect to properties within municipalities and falling within the jurisdiction of either the GLA, RTA, or RLA. The next important obligation that your lawyer is going to do is obtain a land rent certificate. A land rent certificate is required where the land in question holds a leasehold interest. So this is to say, if you are the purchaser and you are buying a land that is on leasehold, you need to have a land rent certificate. However, if it is on freehold, this is not a certificate that you require. The next obligation that your advocate is supposed to get is obtain consent of the Commissioner for Lands. And it is important for us to note that the consent of the Commissioner for Land is required under RTA and the RLA, where the land is leasehold. But if the land is freehold, you do not require consent of the Commissioner for Lands. Another obligation that your lawyer has is obtaining the Land Control Board consent. And this is important, especially where the land in question is agricultural land. If you're buying more than 20 acres, 10 acres, and they're purely for agricultural land, this is when you need to obtain the Land Control Board consent. But if the land that you're getting is not agricultural land, then you do not need this consent. The other type of consent that you need is obtaining town clerk's consent. And this consent is only required where the lessor is a local government. This is saying where the person who is giving you this land is a city council. Then you need to obtain their consent. And this is to say, if the land is freehold, then you do not need this consent. The other obligation that your lawyer or advocate has is obtaining consent of trustees. The requirement for consent of trustees arises in cases of settled land. So what do I mean by this? This we generally mean where the land in question is vested in the national parks of Kenya. Then you need to obtain consent of the trustees just to be on the safe side. In fact, this is a requirement. The other obligation that your lawyer has is obtaining consent of public corporation or obtaining consent of public authority. And of course, this one is required where one is dealing with a public corporation or authority land. So basically, if you're dealing with land that either the train is passing there, that is the Kenya Railway Corporation, you need consent from them. If you're having a land which includes the Kenya Port Authority, you have to obtain the consent of that corporation or that authority. Another obligation that your lawyer has is obtaining a discharge. And this happens where the land in question is a subject to a charge. And of course, you have to get the discharge. And when we're talking about charge, we're basically talking about where it is mortgaged. If it was mortgaged and you bought it and you cleared the other part of the debt that person has, you have to obtain a discharge. Your lawyer has to ensure that you have gotten the discharge. Another important obligation that your lawyer has is payment of stamp duty. This is very important, especially when you're dealing with matters land. And of course, this is charged at 4% of the price declared in the transfer by the parties, especially if this property is in municipalities or if it is in the urban council. For property that is in rural areas, the rate is 2% of the ad valorem value. So thank you so much, guys. I hope you have learned something. I hope you have seen the importance of having an advocate when you're dealing with land. I hope you have learned about some of the obligations a lawyer has and some of the instructions that your lawyer is going to give to you. And so I really insist that it is very important for you when you want to buy property, when you want to buy land, especially here in Kenya, get an advocate if you want to sell it. Get an advocate if you want to purchase it, because sometimes you as an individual, you do not know about all this obligation and all these consents and all these duties that you're required to fulfill. Thank you so much. Feel free to subscribe and feel free to also watch some of my videos that I have done on property law. Bye.